Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pechet. Today's daf is sponsored by Yechiel Berkowitz in loving memory of Sarah Fega Berkowitz. She was a Holocaust survivor, a lover of Torah, and a strong advocate for Jewish education. Today's daf is sponsored by Debbie and Mark Pershan in honor of their new grandson, Zev Shalom, Sydney Pat, whose bris was on the second day of Pesach. With Hakarat Tov to Hashem for the blessing of a new grandson, Mazal Tov to our children, the proud parents, Becca and Ben. We're going to get started now with a reminder of, we saw a Mishnah with a bunch of different opinions, and we don't really need to review them because we're going to review them right now in the Braita. So we're going to start the Braita again at the bottom of Pei Zayin Amud Bet. Tanu Rabbanan. Sheva midot shalach hayu b'mikdash. There were 7 measurements for liquid measure, 7 different sizes of liquid measuring cups in the mikdash. Revi'it halog, chatzi halog, v'log, revi'it hayinu shlishit ahim v'chatzi ahim v'hin. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. This matches what we saw in the Mishnah, except for one thing. It's the reverse order of the first opinion we saw in the Mishnah. So we start off with a quarter log, half a log, a whole log, a quarter of a hin, which is 3 log, a third of a hin, which is 4 log, because a hin is 12 log, chatzi a hin, which is 6, and a hin, which is 12 log. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir Omer, and he's going to say exactly the way we saw it in the first opinion in the Mishnah, hin v'chatzi hin v'shlishit hin, u'revi'it hin v'log v'chatzi log u'revi'it log. Going in the reverse order, right, from largest to smallest. Rabbi Shimon, okay, we're going to get to what's the difference. Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo hayashem hin, v'chimaya hin mishamesh. Of course, there was no hin. What was the purpose of a hin? Okay, now getting to the top of Pechet. Et mi avi tachtav. Okay, there seems to be this assumption that obviously there were 7. So if I'm going to say there was no hin, there must be a different one in its place. Again, we saw this in the Mishnah as well. There was a log and a half. שבו היה מודד לחביתי כהן גדול, לוג ומחצה בבוקר ולוג ומחצה בין 40. For the Kohen Gadol's minchat chavitim, the griddle cake offering the Kohen Gadol brought every day, it was 3 log of oil, but it got split up into morning and afternoon, and therefore they had 1.5 log where they measured for the morning and the afternoon. Amrulo, chatzi log kaitasham. So now we're going to get something we didn't see before, which is a bit of a discussion. They said to Rabbi Shimon, but chatzi log, there was a half log. Now you could take a half log and measure 3 half logs, or theoretically you could do 1 log and a half log. We all know the way we measure in the kitchen, right? Have measuring cups. At some point we got measuring cups that had trying to think of 3/4. I think most of them come with quarter, half, and a cup, right? But dry measuring cups. But right, then they started making 3/4 cups. Now, obviously, you could do a half and a quarter. Now, first of all, you get more precise measurements if you're going to use a 3/4 cup, right? So maybe that's one reason. But anyway, they said you could just do 3 half logs and you'll get to the 1.5 log, and therefore you don't need a separate one that's 1.5 log. Amar lahem. So he says back to them, wait a minute. If you say that to me, I could say that to you about everything. Af l'divrechem chatzi log v'log lo yaseh. Well, then you don't need a half log and you don't need a log at all, because revi'it haytasha ve'efshar l'she'er b'revi'i. You could have just measured a quarter for everything. You don't need a whole log. You could do 4 quarters and you'll get to a log. So your reasoning against what I'm trying to say is preposterous, because then you really won't have anything but a quarter log, and from there you can get to every other measurement. Ela zeh haklal haya b'mikdash. So Rabbi Shimon says this is the rule. Kli shemishamesh midah zo eno mishamesh midah acheret. If it was used for one particular thing, like the half log had its purpose and the whole log had its purpose, so you can't use them for some other purpose, and that's why you needed a log and a half. Now, getting to the next opinion, which we also saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok Omer, shnatot hayu behim v'chule. Okay, they don't even bother telling you the rest because you already know it from before. It was really only one measuring utensil, and it just had notches. Right, the same way we have on our measuring cups in the kitchen, right? The dry ones, we have different ones, but the liquid ones, we just have one big one with notches. You know, it says how much, half cup, quarter cup, third, whatever, right? Quarter cup, third cup, half cup, etc. And that's all. And there was no separate different cups. So now we finish the Braita, and the Gemara is going to start going into the different opinions. So the first obvious question is, Ma'ika ben Rabbi Meir le Rabbi Yehuda. They both had the same 7 measuring implements, but yet one went from lowest to highest, smallest to biggest, and one went from biggest to smallest. Okay, well, you don't need a Braita to give us the different ones if there's really no difference. So there must be some difference. We're going to have a machloket Abaye and Rabbi Yochanan about this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, berutzei midot ika benai. The Beirutze Midot is the overflow. What went either onto the rim of the cup, some people think it's what spilled on the side of the cup, on the outside of the cup. Are they sanctified or not? We saw this actually previously, and we're gonna see it again on Daf Tzadi, big machloket about the Beirutze Midot of the liquid measuring cups. So now we're gonna see. Lemanda Amar Mima. Now, what does that have to do with anything? We really don't know yet. Lemanda Amar Mimata Lamala. If the one who started from the smaller, this was Rabbi Yehuda, Revi, then Chetzi, then one, etc. Well, Kasaval Beirutze Midot Nitkadshu. He held that they were sanctified, and therefore, Revi Yav LeRachmana LeMoshe. How did it all start out? It started off that God said to Moshe, this is a Revi. From here, you're going to create all the other vessels based on this Revi. Now, what does that mean, really? Measure it in such a way that the berutzim, the stuff that dripped on the sides, is actually going to go into the next one. Okay, what does that mean? Well, if I take a quarter log, and I want to now do two of them, right, and put it in a bigger vessel and call that vessel a half log. When I fill up that quarter log, we're assuming some is going to spill on the sides. Now, when I pour from a narrow vessel, because it's smaller, into a wider vessel, it's going to be bigger, the half log, I'm going to naturally, whatever is on the sides of that quarter log is going to drip into that half log. And because they're sanctified, so basically something's going to be a little strange here, and perhaps that's why Abaye disagrees, which is when you measure from a quarter log twice, put two quarter loaves, you're going to get to a half, and now we're going to know this is the exact size we need for a half log. You're actually going to end up with a quarter log plus a little more, and another quarter log plus a little more. So your half log is actually going to be a little more than half a log. And then when you do the same thing and you put two half logs into the bigger one log, you're also, when you figure out, right, okay, two halves of these is going to become one log, you're going to end up with more, because each time, since you're going from a narrower vessel to a wider vessel, your beirutze midot, the stuff on the sides of the vessel, are going to fall into the next vessel. Okay, and that's because if they're sanctified, then you go from smaller to bigger. So you have to make a jump here and say, because they're sanctified, we also want them included in the measurement of the next vessel. Okay, it's a little bit of a difficult thing to get your head around, why we're ending up with a half log that's actually more than a half log. And then when you're going to get to the whole log, it's going to be even more than, because you're going to end up with the beirutze midot of the quarter log and the beirutze midot of the half log. And you're going to get to really even more than an actual log. But that's the way the measurements were set up according to this opinion. Lemanda amar mimala lamata, but if you hold, they went first from a hin, and then God said, okay, well, from the hin, separate into two, and then you'll know what a chatzi hin is. Well, if you're going from a bigger to a smaller, where are the beirutze midot going to end up? On the floor. You're not going to end up with the beirutze midot, and that's because kasavar beirutze midot lo nitkadshu. He held that the outside, the stuff that went on the outside or the rim of the vessel, aren't sanctified. So we don't want them going into the next vessel. So we basically have it that you're going to go from bigger to smaller, and you're not going to end up with the beirutze midot inside because they're going to fall on the floor. V'hin yahiv le'rachmana leMoshe, and in this case, according to Rabbi Meir, God gave Moshe a hin, as we said before, and then amar le sha'er bahad kanaf keberutzin, and measure it with this one. How to split this in half, you're going to have half a hin and half a hin, and you're going to end up without the beirutze midot because they're not sanctified. Abaye amal dekule ama beirutze midot ikalamer nitkadshu v'ikalamer lo nitkadshu. Abaye says this is absolutely nothing to do with this issue. You could say they were, right? Each of them could theoretically say they were sanctified, they weren't sanctified. That's not the issue here. So what's the issue? Their machloket is about the word in the pasuk that we're going to see in a minute. Mileim, full. What does full mean? If I say full, does that mean full, or does it mean even over full? Okay, we're going to see that right now. We're talking about the psukim by the Nisiim in Parshat Naso, when they each brought for the Chanukah Mishkan, for the sanctification of the Mishkan, for the dedication. They each brought a gift, and in the gift it said, one of the things it says is, they had to bring Mizrak Echad Kesef, Shivim Shekel B'Shekel HaKodesh, and right, there was a karat kesef and a mizrak echad kesef. Shnehem meleim solep lula b'shem lemincham. Both were full. That's the full word, meleim, full of solet mixed with oil. Now, solet and oil together, solet is dry, but mixed with oil, it's liquid. So it was a liquid measuring cup that was full. Now, what does it mean full? So Manda Amar Milamala Lamata, the one who said we're going from a big vessel down to the smaller ones, hin and a chatzi hin and all that, kasaval milaim shalei chasil v'shalo yotil. We don't want any more, any less. It has to be an exact, precise measurement. Umand, and therefore, now, what happens? When you pour from a big vessel into a smaller vessel, you have to pour very carefully and slowly. And therefore, okay, when you pour quick, okay, let's get to the other case, which is if you pour fast, it's going to foam up. So if you pour slowly, you're not going to get any foam and you're going to get a very precise measurement. No more, no less. Umanda amar mimata lamala, but the one who says that we started with the revi, and from there Moshe created the chatzi log, he poured the revi twice into the half one. Well, when you pour in a small one into a big one, you pour very fast, it foams up. So the half is going to end up being, again, like we said before, actually more than a half, but this time for a different reason. And he understands mileim shelo yichaseu aval yotir mileim krinim beh. Mileim means full. It means you obviously can't have any less, but you could actually have more. That would be fine. Okay, and you could call that still mileim. Full could also be included in an overfull. That would also be called full as long as it's full. Okay, and that way, again, you end up here the same thing as before, which is the half ends up being a little more than a half, and the log ends up being more than a log, actually. But that's okay according to that opinion. According to Rabbi Meir, that's not okay, and that's why you went from big to small, because it wouldn't be any extra foam, and it would be a more precise measurement. So those are the two different opinions about what the difference is between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Shimon. Marmal. Rabbi Shimon omer lo ayasham hin. There was no hin, so they say Shapir Kamalu Rabbi Shimon, right? Le Rabbanat. Rabbi Shimon is a good point. What did they ever use a hin for? Well, Rabbanan have a hin de avid Moshe l'shemen hamishcha. When Moshe created the shemen hamishcha, he had a hin measurement. Okay, it says there dechtiv v'shemen zayit hin. They took to make the shemen hamishcha, the anointing oil. He took a hin of shemen zayit, of olive oil. So Mar Saval kevan de l'dorot laho batzarich. So the rabbis, Rabbi Shimon, who said there was no hin, said, look, it was a one-time thing. We don't need it for future generations. Lidovot, there's no need for it. So therefore, lefisha, it was just a one-time need. The avde, they made it for that, the ignis, and then they buried it. They didn't need it anymore. The idach, Rabbi Shimon says, kevan the rabbis say, kevan hava. Look, it was there, so we still have it. So it was one of the seven. So now we go back to this Rabbi Shimon who said, well, I got rid of the hin. Which am I going to put in its place? To which the Gemara says, Lo sagi de lo ma'il. Why do you have to put one in its place? What is it? Not enough. Lo sagi means it's not enough. De lo ma'il, that if you wouldn't put a different one in its place. So they say, meaning, could have just been there were six. So now they quote a sugya that we're going to see in actually coming up in two more dapim, and it comes up in other places as well. Like Ravina said about a different question, which we'll see very soon when we get to Daf Tzadi Bet, there's two smichot for communal offerings. Usually only individual offerings you do smicha on the korban, but the parhalim davar shel tzibur, when there's a mistake that the community followed the erroneous ruling of the court, it was an accident, we have to do smicha. Three of the judges do smicha on the korban. And when it comes to the Shiur HaMishtaleach, the scapegoat on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol does smicha on that. Those are the only two public offerings have smicha. How do we know they have smicha? It's a tradition. So just like he answered a question there and said it was a tradition, we can assume, now they don't really know there's a tradition about this, but hachanami, we'd say the same thing here, gemire de sheva midot shalach hayu b'mikdash. That there was obviously a tradition that there were seven measurements, and the truth is when you read the Mishnah, it's quite clear. Because everybody, except for, we're going to get back to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok, and what do we do with him? Everyone else thought it was very obvious that there were seven. It was just a matter of which seven, which order we say them in, and how they were created, or whether we get rid of the hin and put in a different vessel. So it must be there was a tradition. So now we're going to have to figure out Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, and from there we'll move on to, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok. Amar shnatot hayu behin, v'leit le'sheva midot, what, he doesn't have the seven measurements, measuring utensils? Lately, option number one is, yeah, he doesn't have that tradition. Or, ibait ema, option number two, my sheva midot, sheva mididot. Maybe he just said there were seven measurements that were needed in the temple. So he had the measuring cup with the 7 different measurements, and that's what the way he understood the 7. So it's perhaps he did still have the 7. He just had a different meaning for him. Okay, with this we get to the next Mishnah about what each of these measurements were used for. Revi mahayta mishamesh. Okay, what was it used for, the revid? Okay, first of all, you should just know that revid, if you don't know this already, a quarter of a log is the measurement used in general to measure for any kind of liquid measurements for eating purposes. Well, we have kizayid and olive bulk when it comes to food. When it comes to drink, the parallel is generally the revid. Like, for example, 4 cups of wine on Pesach. So there's supposed to be a revid in each cup. Okay, so there's revid is generally the shiur used. So what was the revid used for in the temple? Revid mayim lemitzora, or revid shemen lenazir. So the leper needed water. What part of the process? Well, in the first day, okay, on the 8th day, the leper brings his sacrifices. But before that, he has to go through a 7-day tahara process, because he's also not allowed to come to the temple. Only then can he actually come to the temple. He can't even go in the courtyard yet on day number 8. But before that, he's kicked out of all the machanot. Now, when he's all outside all 3 machanot, so the Kohen comes to him, brings 2 birds, he kills one, slaughters one of them. The blood goes into this quarter log of water. Okay, why a quarter log? The rabbis estimated that at that amount, you could still see the blood. Otherwise, if you had too much water, it would be watered down. So they say that that's the shiur for the mitzvah, that the blood goes into the quarter log. The other bird is dipped also with a hyssop branch into the blood mixed in with the water, and then is sent free. And that basically permits the leper to start coming back into the community, as you know, before that they're outside of all 3 camps. So that's the first day of the leper's process. Okay, we'll come back to this. It's going to be a bit of a problem. If it's a sanctified vessel, what do we need sanctified for? This whole process happens way outside all 3 camps, which aren't sanctified at all, and it doesn't make any sense. And we're going to have a very interesting thing, because Rebbe is going to grapple with a bunch of things in this mission. Now, it's interesting because Rebbe was the one. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's the one who put the Mishnah together, and yet he seems to be grappling with these cases in the Mishnah. Okay, so Revid Shemen LeNazir, quarter log of Shemen for the Nazir, for the 20 loaves that the Nazir has to bring with his offerings. If you remember, this is quarter log, and it's learned out from the Lachmei Todah. I'll go back with the Lachmei Todah. If you remember, there's 40 loaves, 10 are chametz, those have no oil in them. 30 are matzah. Of those 30, a half a log of oil is dedicated to them, but a quarter log goes to 10 of them, and a quarter log goes to the other 20. And those are the same 20, the rikikim and the chalot, which the Nazir brings as well. So from there, they learn that the quarter log that goes for those 20 is the same quarter log that goes for the Nazir. Chatzi log mahayam shamesh. What was the half log used for? Chatzi log mayim lesota. If you remember, the sota has water, that you take water from the kior in the temple, which, by the way, is going to raise a problem here too. Well, it's already sanctified water, so why does it need to be in a sanctified vessel? But we'll get back to that, because remember, the whole thing here is that these are all sanctified vessels. Sanctify what goes in them. Okay, so we're going to have a lot of questions about this Mishnah. Anyway, in that water, if you remember, you put the Megillat Sotah. We write out the whole parsha of the Sotah with God's name in it, and then it gets erased in the water, right? And then she drinks the water. So that's the half log of water that they use for the Sotah. Why half a log? Rashi says here that the half a log, right, Rashi, it's not in Rashi. It must be in, 1 second. Let me just find it. Right. Not the Rashi Ktav, the regular Rashi says Hilchit HaGemirah, which basically means Halach L'Moshe Sinai, which is very strange, because the Mishnah Sota explains why, because they said it's a long parsha and it's not going to be erased in such a small amount of water. Revit log is very small, so it's not going to be erased in that small amount of water. You need a half a log. It's a little strange that Rashi says a Gemara Gemirah, but anyway, remember, this isn't even Rashi; it's the Talmudim of Rashi. But yes, okay. So that's the sota, and also chatzi log shemen letoda. As we said, there's a half a log of oil that goes with all of the Toda offerings. Again, it gets split quarter log for the 10 and the other 20, but it's a half log altogether. Ubelog hayam oded l'chol menachot. The log was used for all the mincha offerings. The mincha offering is an isaron, with a log. Now, you could always bring more than one isaron, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. Afilu mincha shel 60 isaron noten la 60 log. If you decide to bring 60 esronim, the reason they choose that is because that's the biggest you could bring in one vessel. Because a vessel, the biggest vessel, could hold only 60 and still be able to mix them without it all spilling over. But if you did 60 log, you would use, if you did 60 esronim, you would need 60 log because it's log per isaron. And then you would have to measure 60 times using the one log measurement. Okay, you would think maybe if there was a hin, that's 12 log, you could use that. No, it seems like you would have to do one log for each isaron and keep measuring a log at a time. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, afilu mincha shel 60 isaron en la ela loga. He says there's one log, even if you use 60 isaron. In other words, you could change the amount of solid that you need, but it's always the same amount of oil, which seems a little crazy. I don't know how you would mix, right, 60 esronim with one log of oil. That doesn't seem like a good ratio, but that's what he holds. Shenemar lemincha v'log shemen, because it says in the pasuk, this is by the Mitzorah. If he was poor and he couldn't afford it, then he takes keves echad la'asham l'tnufa l'chaper alav yisaron sa l'cha balu b'shemen lemincha v'log shemen. From the lemincha v'log shemen, even though it's talking about a completely different context, they learn from there that every mincha is a log shemen. Okay, even if it's going to be more. And then we have shisha l'par ba'ala ayalu shlosha l'keves. Okay, this comes up in mincha of the holidays, which are still coming after Pesach. Right, this is the daf of the day after Pesach. We've been saying this in our davening every day, which is shlosha esronim l'par. Shisha esronim l'pal. The arba'a esronim la'aylu shlosha l'keves. Okay, that's said in our davening. Why am I having trouble getting the words right now? But anyway, you know the words. So it's 6 esronim. That's the chatzi ahin for the par. Right? There's different animal offerings on the holidays. It's 4 for the ram and 3 for the sheep offerings. 3.5 are needed for 3.5 log for the menorah. Chatzi log l'kol nil. Okay, half a log for each candle. Okay, candle, remember, it doesn't mean a candle. Candle in air, we call it a candle. It's a little, what do you call it? A little, like a vial or a little bowl. That's the word I'm thinking of, really. A little bowl where you would put oil in and there would be a wick coming out of it. We're going to learn about the different parts in a little bit. But for each one of those, it would be a half a log because there's 7 in the candelabra. And that's the last measurement. Okay, now, of course, there was no kli of 3.5. They're just saying it was half a log for each, but this comes last because it's one of the larger measurements. Yativ Rebbe v'kakashale. Now we get to all of Rebbe's difficulties and issues with this Mishnah. Revi lama nimshacha. Why was the Revi nimshacha? For what purpose? Okay, now we saw in the Mishnah what the purpose was. We said, right, Mayim l'mitzorah and Revi Shem and for the Nazir, for the oil for the Nazir. But Rebbe asks, turning out on the bed, Imetzora chutzu. If it's the leper process is done outside. There's no sanctification needed. It doesn't happen in the temple. The Nazir, when do we sanctify the bread of the Nazir? Not in the bowl. Later, remember? Lechem Nazir b'shchitat ayil hu dekadish. When you slaughter the ram that goes along with it, that's when it becomes sanctified. Amarle Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia comes and answers Rabbi's question and says, actually, the Mishnah that you taught, that you learned, that you said, that you recited, that got and it ended up in the Mishnah, actually it's not correct. But Sheba Yamoded l'chavitei kohen gadol, revi'it shemen l'chol chala v'chala. So he says they measure for the chavitei kohen gadol because if you remember, it needs 3 log, but the 3 log are divided into 2 parts, 1.5, 1.5. Each one makes 6 loaves. Okay, altogether there's 12 loaves for the kohen gadol, 6 in the morning, 6 in the evening, or half and half, right? Half of 6 or half of 12 in the morning and half of 12 in the afternoon. But however we divide it, there's basically 6 in the morning, 6 in the evening. So it's 1.5. And if you divide 1.5 into 6, it's a quarter log for each one. So there you have, that's what the quarter log was used for. Kari Ale, when Rebbe heard this, he said, Me'eretz merchak ish atzati. The person who gives me advice, ish atzati, he comes from merchak, from far away. Rabbi Chia came from Babylonia. So Rebbe said, you, Babylonian, you made me understand what I didn't understand before. Now, it's It's interesting if Rebbe put together the Mishnah, why he didn't change the Mishnah. It's possible that was just everyone was used to this Mishnah and they just left it, even though really, theoretically, Rabbi Chia has a better explanation. And we're going to have a similar thing now. Chatzilog mahayam shamesh. So Yativ Rebbe v'kakashale. Again, Rebbe sat there and said, this doesn't make sense. Chatzilog lamanim shach. Isota. So what was the chatzilog for? Isota v'chei chulinu ditzriche lekidushe. Is it chulin that it needs sanctification? I said this before. Mayim kedushim ktiv. It has to be sanctified waters that come straight from the kior that's in the temple. The water's already sanctified there because it's already in a vessel called the kior, which is a sanctified vessel, the basin. Toda, so it doesn't need sanctification. If it's the toda, we said the oil for the toda, well, lachmei toda, just like we said with the nazir, bishchitat toda udekachi. It's when you slaughter the toda, the animal, that it becomes sanctified, not when it goes in the bowl. So neither one really needs sanctification. So Amalei Rabbi Shimon Rebbe, this time it's Rebbe's son who answers him. Shebo hayam chalek chatzi log shemen lechol ner v'ner. What we saw at the end of the Mishnah, each candle needed a chatzi log, and therefore they used the chatzi log specifically for that, and that would sanctify the oil that would then go into the menorah. Amar lo. So now he again responds with a pasuk, like he did with Rabbi Chia. Ner Yisrael kachaya. So he quotes this Ner Yisrael. He says, actually, I don't even think it's a pasuk. He basically says, Ner Yisrael, you're the light of Israel, and kachaya, you're right. That's actually what they used it for. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Rebbe. So now Rabbi Yochanan comes and says in the name of Rebbe. Now we're on a bit of a different topic, but it's going to relate soon. Ner shekavta. If you have a candle that went out, okay, there's a whole debate about exactly when it went out, but we're not going to get into that right now. The candle goes out. Nidashen Hashem and nidashna haptila. So if the oil got full of ashes, and the wick was full of ashes, presumably what some of the commentaries say is the wick was full of ashes, the ashes dropped into the oil, now the oil is full of ashes. You can't relight it when it's full of ashes. It's actually one of the things the Kohanim would do is they would always clean out the candle at the nair. Again, it's not really a candle. They would clean out that bowl at the end of the day because it was always dirty. So actually they would do it when it was done, right? I forget exactly what time of day they would do it, but anyway, without getting into that, so if it gets dirty before it finishes burning and it went out, what do? Ketzad oseh. Because you can't light it when it's full of ashes. That's not like an appropriate way to light the menorah. So mitiva v'notem b'shemen umadlika. So you clean it out and then you put oil in and you light it again. Okay, so basically you have to refill it. But yativ Rabbi Zreika v'kamid b'ayla. Rabbi Zreika comes and asks the following question. When he puts the oil in, with the original amount that was there from the beginning, or he just fills in whatever he took out, that's the amount he puts in. Okay, whatever was meant to still be burning. Good question. It's actually almost a classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question. And what's interesting about this is Rabbi Yirmiyah answers the question. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, pshita dekemida rishona. Obviously, it's the way it was originally. To eat kamash chascha, because if it was what was remaining in there, how would you know how much was missing? If you say you measured it using the measuring, and this is why it's here, using all the measuring cups you had in the temple, that shouldn't be sheva midot. You would need a ton of different measurements. You would need an eighth of a cup, 3/8 of a cup, right? All different kinds of measurements because who knows how much, right? If let's say we know it has to be less than a half, but it could be 3/8. It could be an eighth of a cup. It could an eighth of a log, right? You would need a lot of measurements to be able to get it precise. And therefore, he said it must be that you just replace the entire amount. Kare ale, we have a third time now in today's daf. This time, Rabbi Zreika is the one who says it. He said about Rabbi Yirmiyah, "V'hadrach tzlach." Okay, your glory should be successful. Rechav al dvar emet v'anavat tzedek. Okay, you should ride on truth. In other words, you speak words of truth and humility and righteousness. Okay. So he's basically praising him for coming up with a good answer. Itmar nami. It was also said that Amar Rabbi Avahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that either Rabbi Abahu said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, V'amrela, and some people say Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Rabbi. It was quoted in the name of Rabbi. Ner shekaftani dashen Hashem and nidashna ptila. Okay, so if it goes out and it all gets dirty, Keitzad said, what do you do? Mitiva v'notem b'shemen kimida rishona madlika. This version has it saying exactly what Rabbi Yirmiyah said, which you put in the oil as it was originally, in the amount that it was originally, and relight it. Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Sheshet. So now we're going to have a statement of Rav Sheshet, which is going to cause some problems. They're going to have a contradiction, and then we're going to actually say there's a Tannaitic debate about this, and this is going to take us to the end of our daf. Ner shebamikdash shel prakim hava. The ner that we're talking about in the menorah was flexible. Okay, it could be twisted on it, like turned over. Okay, it was flexible. So Kasaval, he must have held kiktiv kikar umiksha, when it says that the menorah was made of kikar zahav, of gold, and it was miksha, which means the whole thing was made of one piece of gold. It wasn't like different parts that were separate. It was all made of one piece of gold. A menorah v'nerot aktiv. Must be talking about the menorah and the nerot, the little bowl that held the oil. Kevan demibaya hatava. Why? Because it needs, now, since it needs cleaning, everyone knows that nerot need cleaning every day. Now, if it's all one piece, ilav de prakim hava, if it wasn't flexible, that could be bent, hava ilav de prakim hava, if it wasn't prakim, lo hava metayvale, you would have no way of cleaning it. You have to turn the menorah upside down or tilt it on its side. The menorah was huge. You wouldn't be able to do that. It was also heavy. It was made of a lot of pounds of gold. So it must be that the way they cleaned it, right? It's very hard to clean if you can't pick it up and take it off. So it must be it was flexible and it tilted over. Okay, just the ner part. Okay, you could tilt it over, and that's how it was made. So it was all one piece of gold, but it was a piece that was flexible. Meitiv. Now they bring a contradiction. Ketzado said, what does he do? Misalkano menicham ba'oel. He would take them off, the ner, and put them in the tent. Umekancham besfog, and he would clean them with a sponge. V'notein b'hem shemen umadlikam, and then he would put the oil in again and relight them. So who, right, and then light them. In other words, this is what they would do every day when they would be lahativa tanerot, right? They would clean them. So it sounds like they completely removed them, which means it's not miksha achat. And they didn't need to be flexible. They were just a separate section. So Huda Amar Ki Aitana. So they say, well, Rav Sheshet is holding by a different Tana, and we're going to see there's a Tannaitic machloket. And then soon we'll see what the machloket is based on. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita. Chachamim omrim, lo hayu mezuzin otam imkoma. They wouldn't move it from its place. So now they say, Michalal, what are you going to infer here? Di baile azuze matze mazizle? Wait, you think if they wanted to, they could have moved it when it says, okay, what they mean is they're talking about the ner. The nerot there would never be moved from their place. So they're saying, not that they could have, they didn't, but it couldn't be moved because it was attached. It was all part of the same piece. And that's who Rav Sheshet holds by. Now they're going to say, Man Chachamim, who is this opinion, though, of? The Rav Sheshet holds like the rabbis, but who really says this? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok. It's Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, who also appeared in our Mishnah, not connected. But Detanya, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, Omer, Kimintas shel zahav hayala al gaban. It had a little cover of gold, like a thin piece of gold that covered it. Kishu mitiva dochako klape pia. Okay, I imagine it like almost like it had a hinge on one side. So you would tilt it upward, and then then he would tilt over the whole ner, and with that he would clean it. And then when he would put the oil in, he would cover the cover of the ner. If you look at pictures of the menorah, you can see there's a little vial or bowl in which the oil goes, and on top of it, it has a gold cover. That's what they're talking about here, this tas. Right? And then when he would clean it, right, he would then close it. Okay, and the wick would come out of there. And now they're going to show the actual basis of this machloket. They actually disagree about the way to read the psukim. Okay, Ditanya, we're going to see now the two approaches. So basically, we saw that the Rav Sheshet held like the rabbis, who really was Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, who basically explained that the ner stayed in place. And basically, when you would clean it, you would open this kind of cover on it, tilt it over, clean it out, put it back in place, put back the cover with the wick coming out of it. So now they're going to say it's all based on this machloket. Menorah v'nerotea ba'ot min hakikar. So the menorah and the nerot, this is what Rav Sheshet holds by, all came from the kikar zahav. Okay, a measurement of gold that they would make it all miksha achat, one piece. Ve'en malkachea u'machtotea min hakikar. But the tongs that they would use to get the wicks in and out, and the machtot, which some people describe as either pans or spoons that they used to basically clean things out, were not from the same kikar zahav. Okay, they were separate pieces. That makes sense. Rabbi Nechemia omer, menorah הייתה באה מן הכיכר, ולא נרותיה או מלקחיה או מחתותיה באו מן הכיכר. Here comes Rabbi Nechemia. He says the other opinion, the opinion of the Braita we brought earlier to disagree with Rav Sheshet. What do you mean? The nerot were completely separate parts, and they were detachable, just like the tongs and the malkachea and the machtotea. So, but my kamiflige, what's the root of their machlok? And it really comes down to parshanu of the pasuk. Ditanya, as we see in a Braita, okay, b'haikra. In this particular pasuk, they had an issue. Ditanya, kikar zahav tahor yaseoto. It should be made from, right, yaseota. It should be made, the menorah, from kikar zahav tahor, from a kikar of, that's a weight of pure gold. Lamanu lemenorah sheba min kikar. Okay, from here you see the menorah came from this kikar. Minayin lerabot nerotea. Now, how do you know also the nerot? And that's from the continuation of the pasuk. Talmud lomar et kol hakelim ha'ele. It says, make it and all the other vessels. Now, what are all the other vessels if not the nerot? So now they say, well, once you say kol hakelim, it sounds like all the vessels. So yachol shani marbeach malkachea u'machtotea. Maybe also the tongs and the bowls or pans were also made from the same gold and one piece. Talmud Amar Ota, Divrei Rabbi Nechemia. So the word Ota, and this is all Rabbi Nechemia, because it says Yaseh Ota, Ota is limiting, Kol HaKelim is expanding, so it's expanding to include specifically the nerot, the part that held the oil, but it's not expanding to include the other pieces, and that's limited by the word Ota. And that's Divrei Rabbi Nechemia. That is basically the first opinion about how to read this pasuk. So what do you see? The nerot are part of it. This creates a bit of a problem, something we saw earlier, because then Rabbi Nechemia is on the side where we put Rav Sheshet. And what did we say? Kasha Rabbi Nechemia to Rabbi Nechemia. But Rabbi Nechemia we brought before, he was specifically the one who said, I'm just looking for it inside, right? Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Tzad, Rabbi Nechemia said menorah was from the kikar, but not neroteh. He doesn't think the nerot were part of it. So now we have a different contradiction between the last two Braitot we brought. One put Rabbi Nechemia on one side and one put Rabbi Nechemia on the other, to which they simply answer Trei Tanai Vali Rabbi Nechemia. It's just two different Tanaim who disagree about what Rabbi Nechemia held. Okay, so we're going to put that issue aside. But that was one way of reading the pasuk. The Kol HaKelim includes the nerot. Now we're going to have to see the other part. So back to the Braita. That was just a break in the Braita to say there's some contradiction here. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha omer menorah ba'a min hakikar. Ve'em malkachea u'machtotea v'nerotea ba'a min hakikar. The menorah came from the kikar, but not the malkachea, machtotea, and not the nerotea. Okay? Ela, mani mekayem et kol hakelim ha'elu. So what do I do with that pasuk? With others' vessels? Shayu kelim shel zahav. So they say, they were also made of the same pure gold that the menorah was made of. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, I don't need it kol hakelim ha'elu to say these were made from pure gold. Zahav be'ediktiv bo. It already says, Vasita nerotea shiva ve'ela nerotea ve'ir alever paneha u'malkachea u'machtotea zahav tahol. It already says, make the nerot 7. You should put up the candles, and they should light up. And the malkachea u'machtotea are made of pure gold. So you would think, already from there, they're pure gold. You don't need another pasuk to tell you it's kol hakelim ha'elu. So how can you say it's there to say it's gold? Lo tzricha ela lefi nerot. What they needed for is specifically where the wick came out, the part of the candle where the wick, the bowl, where the wick goes. You might have thought, sal gadat hachamina hu'il pi nerot ashchure mashchav, where the candle comes out, where the wick comes out, gets blackened a lot. So maybe you would have thought, Atorah chasa al mamonan shel Yisrael v'le'avet zahav kol dehu. Maybe the Torah had Rachmanas on us and said, look, I don't want you guys, the Jews, to have to spend so much money and it's just going to get ruined, right? Because it's going to get all blackened. Maybe it doesn't need to be pure gold. Kamash malan. That's what it Kol hakelim ha'elu comes to say. No. It actually has to be like pure gold. It has to be made of pure gold as well. That's what we use. That's called a kelim ha'ele. Even the part where the wick comes out, where it gets the most black, you still have to deal with that. Now, on this topic of Torah Chasam Amanat Yisrael, which came up also a few dapim ago, Alana Steinhain gave a shiur about it in Zvachim, and we reposted it now because it's a very interesting shiur about this concept of, on the one hand, you want things to be beautiful. On the other hand, there's this concern of spending too much money. And it's an excellent shiur and worth listening to of Din and Daf. So it should be back up on the site, connected with this stuff, so you should be able to find it easily in the Beyond the Daf content on the website. Okay, plus we sent the links out during the week. Okay, so with that, we finished for today. Do a quick review. We have the Sheva Midot, right? And we had this tradition, and then it was just different debates about how they created the kelim. Did they start from the smaller to the bigger to the smaller? Two different interpretations of that machloket. Then we went into Rabbi Shimon, who said there was no hin. What the rabbis think there was a hin, because when they made the Shemana Mishcha that one time, they used it, so they kept it. Rabbi Shimon thinks they didn't keep it. We got to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok. What did he do with the 7? Because he thinks it was just one. Maybe 7 mididot, 7 measurements, even though it was one vessel, or maybe he just didn't agree with that whole tradition. Then we got into all the different measurements and what they're used for. But Rebbe had a bunch of issues with a bunch of them. The Chatzi log, the Revi'it log, and then basically Rabbi Chia bailed him out of one, Rabbi Shimon, his son, bailed him out of the other and explained to him it really was something else. So even though we read the Mishnah, we then kind of corrected the Mishnah. And then we went into how did they fix the menorah. When it got dirty, they had to dump out everything and start again. And we learned to start from the beginning. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, measure the whole thing. And that was because otherwise we would need all different kinds of sizes of measuring utensils, which we don't have. And that connected with that issue. And from there, we got off to the whole thing about cleaning out the nair, and that the nair must have been flexible. But then we saw some people think it's flexible because it was all miksha achad, but if you hold it wasn't miksha achad, the menorah was, but not the nair part, it was separate, then you don't have to say it was flexible, it was just removed to clean it. And we saw the different debate there about how they read the psukim and how they got to the different opinion, whether the nair is part of the whole menorah as one miksha, one piece, or was it a separate part that could be removed? With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Yisru Chag Sameach, or for those keeping second day Chag. We'll wishing everyone a good day and Besorot Tovot.